Let's talk.
Charles Brown.
The Absinthe Forger, a true story of deception, betrayal, and the world's most dangerous spirit. This is the story of the eccentric grifter who blew up the lucrative black market for vintage bottles of the legendary drink of artistic renegades, absinthe. I am delighted to say that joining us, and hopefully not pouring him a swift one before we get going, otherwise this interview is going to be very interesting indeed, the author of The Absinthe Forger, Evan Rail. Evan, good morning to you, sir.
Good morning, Giles.
And whereabouts are you this morning?
Oh, I'm in Prague, Czech Republic. I've lived here for about 25 years.
A very good place in the world, and a place that takes its drinking seriously. I think we could conclude on this one.
It sure does. It actually helped kick off the global absinthe revival with Czech absinthe about 30 years ago.
Well, you see, back in the day, because I don't anymore, thank goodness, but back in the day, I prided myself in drinking pretty much everything that could be possibly put in front of me. But absinthe was one that even myself, warning bells went off about. So for those, and I study my history of art, so I know that absinthe is also, the green fairy and all that, and it was huge amongst the post-impressionists, the Toulouse-Lautrec, etc. So give me a potted or a bottled history of absinthe.
Oh, well, absinthe started out as a medicine like most spirits did. It was used to treat stomach ailments and so forth. But it became really popular in 19th century Paris, the Gay Paris, the Belle Epoque era, as a drink of, both sophisticated drinkers and then poets and painters and other disreputable types who drank it in seedy cafes, and people like Van Gogh painted absinthe. Toulouse-Lautrec painted absinthe into his paintings. So you really get this cultural element to absinthe that is quite unlike any other spirit. It was really connected to creativity and artistic types, romantic types, and even some tragedies.
Is this? I mean, what's the base of? Is it herb? Is it what's the concoction of? What's it made out of?
Yeah, sort of like gin. It is a clear spirit that is a lot of herbs in it. The main three herbs are wormwood, anise, and fennel, and they create a sort of sweet licoricey taste. It's colored to be green, but it can be clear as well. It's just a really strong spirit with a high amount of bitterness and a lot of aromatic herbs that are really delicious, light, floating sort of scents that really sort of elevate your spirits and make you start daydreaming if you drink it.
Yeah, this is what I used to refer to back in the day as a stealth drink, i.e., you would have one and think, oh, that's really very, very nice, and the next thing you know, you're waking up, probably, in your case, probably somewhere in Budapest, going, what on earth happened to my trousers?
How did that happen?
Exactly.
Yes. I actually was drinking absinthe in the middle '90s before it was reintroduced in the West. I was in Prague in 1998 and 1999, so. That's really before it was made legal again in France, and it was not being imported to the UK. But in late 1999, it started being imported to the UK. Czech absinthe started being imported to the UK, to London. It was a major scene. It was a huge, sort of because of that reputation of it being dangerous and associated with artistic types. It became a very popular drink, and a lot of people got into not just the modern absinthe that were being imported, but the historic ones from before it was banned, from before World War I.
But why was it banned? Was it the fact that people were having sort of 3 glasses of absinthe and then literally, basically, either passing out, dying, doing ridiculous things? What was the reason for actually banning this one and not banning, say, a Fernie Branca or something like that?
Yeah, absinthe had a connection to crime, and it was associated with a really famous murder in Switzerland, famous at the time in around 1908 or so. But what happened actually was that a Swiss farmer drank some absinthe and murdered his family, tried to kill himself. But in fact, he had consumed several bottles of red wine, several cognacs, a few creme de menthe, and then some absinthe, and had this reputation for it. The drink had a reputation for making people go crazy and lose their minds and do crimes and so forth. So after that, and with a lot of pushback from the French wine industry, because the French wine industry was sort of wanting to get its customers back who had moved over to absinthe, there was a move to ban absinthe at the end of the 19th century. It was thought of as destroying the French nation. It was thought of as leading to the decline of French civilization. So in 1914 and then permanently in 1915, once the war started, they banned it completely in France. It had already been banned in Switzerland, Belgium, most other countries. And that created, 100 years later, when absinthe became popular again, there was this gap, and people wanted to seek out these bottles from what they call pre-ban bottles from before World War I, to taste the absinthe that the Romantic poets, the Impressionist painters had been drinking.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there are fashions in all things. There are fashions in wine. There are fashions in drink. I mean, I remember when Sapporo came out in London in the 90s, and I was living there, which was the Japanese beer, and then we had the Belgian beers came out, and then we had the real Budvar came over, which was a revelation from you. And of course, absinthe becomes very trendy. It's got this rock and roll sort of, this sort of poets, writers. So it's a very, it's got that rock and roll before rock and roll sort of came into being sort of look for bohemians.
Exactly.
And of course, people want to discover the real thing. Oh, I've found a bottle, Matilda, of Toulouse-Lautrec left behind the latrine, by the Moulin Rouge. And that, of course, so a load of people get involved who maybe don't know their drink history, and somebody comes up and says, you'll never guess what, I was over on, the left bank, and I opened up a cellar that had been closed for 200 years, and I found 5,000 bottles of absinthe. And that is the way but that is the way, and people go, oh, great, fantastic, and pay exorbitant prices. Tell us about the situation that led to this, the Absinthe Forger then.
Well, the plain truth is that there are pre-ban bottles. They're out there. Yeah. I've tasted about a dozen of them myself, authenticated, very expensive, with collectors and in basically museums. Those exist. So just knowing that those exist feeds the thirst, if you will, builds the thirst for others to taste them. There are collectors who buy and sell, dealers who buy and sell these historic bottles. So there's a lot of interest in getting them. A lot of people wanted to know what it tastes like. Because there was a gap where it was banned for about 100 years, people think that the older stuff must be better or must be different, or at least connects them to those artistic heroes like Hemingway, Oscar Wilde, Van Gogh, who drank absinthe. So there's a lucrative market out there to buy and sell these collectible bottles. They exist. They come on the market every month. Somebody finds a new Pernod from 1910. It really is true. You can get them at Sotheby's. They're authenticated. But there was room for one individual based in London to start selling fraudulent bottles, counterfeits that he was making himself. And as this happened, he was selling more and more of them and ripping off more and more people very subtly. The community of collectors, which is very secretive, it's underground, they started noticing that there were just sort of too many bottles, historic bottles appearing, and a few of them formed a little group, basically Agatha Christie. Amateur detectives started collecting evidence about these bottles and putting two and two together, and eventually figured out who it was who was creating these false bottles.
And so what we're looking here is not somebody approaching you, in a wine bar or in a bar in London and saying, by the way, I've got some,
no.
This is another level. This is somebody in the way that the art market operates or the antiques market operates, perhaps.
Yes, no, this was high level, almost perfect fraud. It was done. It turns out the person who was creating these counterfeits was a well-known collector, well-known in the underground community, in these sort of private soirees where collectors gather in little, not public events to trade bottles from 1910 or 1890 and open up these old bottles. One of the members of that community was the guy who was creating these forgeries, and they were perfectly done because everybody will tell you this guy, this collector, the Absinthe Forger himself, has an incredible palate. He is a person who can taste an absinthe and tell you who is the maker, blind tasting. He knew how to recreate the taste of these historic bottles because of his own experience as a collector. So he was buying new absinthes or absinthes that weren't that old, blending them with a little bit of brandy or creme de menthe or something to create a little bit of an older taste profile. And he did a very, very good job. He had an incredibly talented palate to be able to put together these forgeries. And then, you have these amateur detectives who also have very good palates, and they know a little bit more about absinthe than he does. he does. So they're able to put together the evidence and figure out how he was creating these forgeries and exactly who the person was who was making them.
I mean, presumably he's not going down. Presumably he's not going down to the local sort of hypermarket buying sort of whatever absinthe from off the shelves and then mixing it like that. I mean, are there sort of craft absinthe makers in the time, and also getting the bottles? I mean, does he have access to the bottles and the corkage? Because that's got to be a thing itself. You can't say, here's a 5-litre jug of absinthe. It's got to be its provenance has got to be sort of proven, even if you're faking it.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Absinthe was created in an era that was filled with wonderful art, the Belle Epoque, the fin de siècle era of 19th century Paris. So there are a lot of collectors of all of the stuff from that era, including empty bottles of absinthe that have just been empty for 120 years. So you can buy an empty bottle of absinthe, an empty absinthe bottle, a historic one, on French eBay for €50. And then there are craft distillers who are making good absinthe today who sell their bottles for maybe, I don't know, 50, 100 euros. So you're in for 100, 150 euros. You can buy the labels, the historic labels, 100-year-old labels or 120-year-old labels, €5. You put all that together, you're in for about 200 euros. You mix it, you find a way to create some taste that tastes approximate. You sell it to an unsuspecting novice for 5,000 euros.
Whoa. Yeah, well, that's a markup, and you can see why he is wanting to do this, and presumably because he is in the market and he's a bit of a bon vivant. He's not, he's a recognised name, so people are going to trust him.
Yeah, exactly. He was considered an authority. Part of the thing that I wanted to do with the Absinthe Forger, the book, was invite readers into this underground culture of absinthe collectors, the people who are tracking down 150-year-old bottles, literally. And these are things that are in museums and should be in museums. But these collectors are so hedonistic that they track down these 120, 150-year-old bottles, and they open them. They drink them. So part of what worked for the Absinthe Forger, the man himself, the counterfeiter, was that he was selling bottles to people who would consume them, which means that the evidence for his crimes was being drunk up, disappeared.
Of course, yes. Yeah. And again, I suppose it is, he's doing something illegal, but also the people drinking this, when it really should be being preserved. And there's a frisson of danger and just being this right side of the law, so they don't really want to come, because the thing with forgeries, people don't want to say, I paid 5,000 euros for something that was worth 200. They look like idiots,
That's part of the reason why he was able to get away with it, I think, for so long. Now, in the end, he ended up being identified and outed, but a lot of people didn't want to acknowledge that they'd been ripped off. As one collector told me, if you've put 3,000 or 5,000 euros into a historic bottle, you have to believe it's real. Your brain doesn't work so that you can go, I think that's fake. And quite a few people were afraid to admit that they'd been conned. Some people who ran museums, people who had big collections, people who were known as authorities in this underground world of collectors were kind of ashamed to say, I got duped.
Was it a question of him getting then greedy? Because this happens a lot with forgers, for example, when they're doing famous people's signatures, which is another underground thing with collectors. I mean, it's a case of they go on a run and they're making a load of money, but like all things, they don't know when to quit when they're ahead, and so they just get greedy and there's too much coming onto the market.
Yeah, I think one of the things that the amateur detectives, the little group of Agatha Christie's, who identified this guy, always said was that they started to get suspicious because he was coming up with a new bottle every week. And now, historic absinthe, pre-banned bottles, we do find those. They surface. You can buy them at Sotheby's or wherever. They are available. But this guy was coming up with one every week, and not just Pernod, which is the most famous brand. It was the bulk of production. Maybe 90% of all absinthe production was under the Pernod brand. He was coming up with brands that you and I have never heard of, that absinthe collectors have never seen. And then he was posting little posts about it. Hey guys, I found this bottle. It looks really good. I'm going to be selling it out. You can buy a little shot if you want to buy, or you can buy the whole bottle. He was posting it in these private groups online. And it was just too much. It was just over the top. So they began to get suspicious when they saw just the number of rare bottles he was turning up. So, one every 7 days. So
is there, I mean, that's getting silly, isn't it? I mean, is there a dramatic showdown? Does he get cornered by a group of, bottle-wielding Agatha Christie types, or how did it all sort of... I mean, I don't want to give it a whole ending, because we want people to go out and buy the book, obviously, even, but I mean...
Yeah. I don't want to ruin the book for anyone else, but I will tell you that my plans for writing the book changed in the middle of the book, because I had done all of this research, and I had contacted a bunch of people, and I had chased down the story, and I'd gone to Switzerland and Germany and France and all of these countries, talking to the collectors, visiting these cellars, tasting these historic bottles. And one day I got an email from the Absinthe Forger himself, who said, "Hey, you've been contacting my friends from college, from university, asking them about me. I want you to stop." So in the middle of writing this book, the story suddenly changed, because I became part of the story in a way that I hadn't expected when I set out to write a book called The Absinthe Forger.
So obviously there's research in this, and it must be fascinating to because it's there was a big thing for craft beer, but this is a drink which went underground. There's a political history to it as well, because this is behind the Iron Curtain, etc. as well.
Some of it.
Because nothing exists in a vacuum. So it must have been really fascinating to sort of bring all those strands together, as well as those most colourful characters, of course, that everybody knows. We said before, Moulin Rouge, etc.
Oh, yeah. You can picture Kylie Minogue as the Green Fairy, dancing in the background as you're trying to recreate this historic milieu, this setting where artists and dancers and writers were coming together and having these creative soirees, right? And at the same time, there's this underground world today where collectors are getting together in not public parties, very, very private affairs, to open these historic bottles. It was a really fun journey for me to learn so much about the absinthe world and the world of collecting rare spirits.
The secret group of people enjoying illicit tipples, these are the inebriati, aren't they? Let's face it.
Yeah, they call themselves absinteurs. It's the French word for, an absinther, a guy who drinks it. Some of the absinthe they enjoy actually came from Spain. There's what do you call absenta? There are a few good brands that are there. Others are from Germany and Switzerland and France, and it's just been a really fascinating journey to be part of. And
so, I mean, this is something you do on a regular basis. You track down, which sounds obviously, this would have been my perfect job, but I probably wouldn't have been able to write. But I wouldn't have been able to write afterwards. So, I mean, should other collectors be? I mean, should other collectors of spirits and wines be sort of buyer beware and keep their wits around them? Do you think?
Oh, for sure. At any time there's money involved, there's a motive for fraud. So we know, for example, that there's far more famous Bordeaux wines sold in China than are produced in China. The Lafittes and so forth, the Chateau Lafite, there's more of them sold in China than are produced every year in China. We know this happened. One of the chapters in my book actually details other fraud in wine and spirits, which we know is going on. There are, once bourbon becomes big and there are collectible bourbons and people are putting much more money into buying rare bourbons or rare scotch, those frauds start showing up. This is one thing that happened simply because absinthe became big again, but it's largely an underground community. It's a spirit that really is kind of not for the great masses. Not everybody likes the taste of something that's a little bit like licorice.
So what are you hoping that people will learn from the Absinthe Forger?
Oh, I want people to read an interesting real-life mystery story about a bunch of amateur detectives and get a sense of the romance and mystery that surrounds this rare spirit. It's been talked about, demonized, you would have to say, for over a century. That people have been saying absinthe makes people go crazy. Absinthe ruins your mind. Absinthe makes you murder. And it's not really that bad. It's a wonderful spirit with a rich history that has a place at the table or at the bar. And a lot more people should try it. It's still quite an underground spirit, a little bit of a rare taste, if you will. And I hope more people get into it.
The book is called The Absinthe Forger. It's by Evan Rail, who's been to today. If people want to find you online, please tell me you have a social media presence or a website.
I do. Just like Thierry, I'm on Blue Sky. I use Blue Sky. I'm Evan Rail at Blue Sky, and you can find me on Instagram as well.
The book
as Evan Rail.
And you can also order the book, and I urge you to do that. Perfect for if you want to get an early Christmas present in or something like that. Perfect by our own virtual bookstore on tre.radio. The book is called The Absinthe Forger. It's by Evan Rail. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me on.